Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere quiet. Somewhere with layers of silk, the flicker of oil lamps, and petals so delicate they were once more valuable than gold. You'll be strolling through the Ottoman Empire, not through its battles or its palaces, but through its flower beds. Specifically, its soft, carefully curated, very serious tulip obsession. Yes, tulips. Those upright little flowers you can get in a bundle at a gas station? They were once objects of mystery, power, coded messages, and even low-key espionage. You're stepping into a world where gardening was diplomacy, where flowers spoke in riddles, and where men in oversized robes debated the poetic merits of a bloom's third stripe. And spoiler, you probably wouldn't survive long. Not because of any danger, but because you'd accidentally mispronounce the name of a tulip variety and offend someone very powerful over sherbet. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always lovely seeing where we're all dreaming from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking slowly now. The courtyard under your feet is a checkerboard of warm stone, still holding the sun's memory long after dusk. There's a slight breeze. It smells of crushed mint, maybe a little saffron, and something sweeter, earth warmed by clay pots, and the unmistakable powdery scent of tulips. Not tulips in a garden store kind of way. These tulips are bred and arranged to theatrical levels of perfection. They aren't just flowers. They're design statements. You move past rows of them, their petals standing upright and still, almost reverent. Ottoman gardeners, called bastanchis, have been tending this patch for months. Some of them may have taken an oath about this flower bed. That's not a joke. The Ottomans believed in order. Tulips were no exception. Only certain people could plant them. Specific months were designated for display. Whole gardening manuals were written about when to water them, preferably before dawn, using water drawn from specific cisterns that had stood still long enough to not startle the roots. The word for tulip in Turkish is lail, which also happens to be an anagram of Allah in Arabic script. Coincidence? Not to 17th century Istanbul. That made the tulip wholly adjacent. You weren't just planting flowers, you were participating in something vaguely sacred, like planting silent prayers in rows. And here's the thing, nobody shouted about tulips. There were no parades. No chaotic street fairs. Tulip culture was quiet. You showed off with a whisper. You wore a tulip motif on your slipper buckle. You sent someone a painted tulip on rice paper. Or you invited a rival dignitary to your garden and let the flowers do the talking. It was weaponized subtlety. Historians still argue whether the obsession came from religion, imperial power flexing, or just a good old-fashioned hobby that spiraled out of control. Likely it was all of the above. But one thing's certain, tulips were everywhere. They crept into textiles, glimmered on dishes, danced across poetry, and stared back from mirrors. They had their own vocabulary. A particularly upright tulip might represent pride. One with a curling petal edge might suggest melancholy or restraint. It was like flower-based passive aggression. You pause by a fountain now. The water trickles, not gushing, because even the fountains here are quiet. And behind it, a gardener in loose cotton bends down, brushing dust from a single pot. He's not trying to impress. He's maintaining balance. Harmony. Tulips were symmetry. A kind of visual music. Now, don't get too distracted, but fun fact, some folks whispered that certain tulips only bloomed when read poetry aloud. That's probably not botanically accurate, but Ottoman garden lore didn't care. If someone said it, and it sounded poetic enough, it might as well be real. And you, tiptoeing through the twilight of a palace courtyard, can't help but believe it a little too. The stars are beginning to blink awake above the domes, and the flowers don't move, but somehow, they seem more alive now. As if they're listening. You pass a low stone bench. There's a cushion left behind, embroidered, of course, with a repeating tulip motif. every petal stitched in exacting detail. Somewhere nearby, a scribe is probably recording what color those tulips bloomed this season. Did they lean left? Did they fade too fast? The bureaucracy of Ottoman gardening was intense, but also weirdly calming. You imagine someone hand-copying a report titled, "Observations on the variegated reds of April." And why not? In a world with wars and taxes and plagues, tulips were control. A well-placed petal in the right pot meant the empire was still beautiful. Still orderly. Still itself. You move forward. A lantern flickers to life beside a wooden door carved with arabesques. You're not knocking. You're just resting. Maybe near the edge of a raised bed. There are soft sounds, the brush of fabric, the creak of shoes, the faint clink of porcelain from deep within the house. And above it all, the gentle presence of tulips, breathing without sound, watching without eyes. And maybe you, too, are beginning to feel it. That quiet obsession. That slow pull. The hypnotic repetition of form and color. A garden of almost symmetry. Almost messages. Almost mysticism. And hey, if a flower could talk, would it tell you a secret? Or just smile politely and stay silent? Doesn't matter. You're here now. And there's still so much more to see. You're still in the garden, but now the breeze has shifted. The night air curls around the tops of the walls, carrying the dry scent of old stone and something else. Spiced? Earthy? The ghost of saffron from a nearby kitchen, maybe. Or crushed rose petals left behind on a silk sash. You're not sure. But you follow it. You step under a carved wooden arch, its underside painted with floral swirls. There's no label, no. Welcome to the Tulip History Pavilion. This isn't a museum. It's a living trail. And the story goes back centuries before these gardens were even planned. The journey of the tulip begins far from Istanbul, way out in the wild steppe regions of Central Asia. Think vast landscapes, fierce winds, and flowers that somehow managed to survive anyway. These tulips weren't pampered. They were short, scrappy little bursts of color poking through gravel and goat tracks. No perfumed gardeners, no ornate pots, just raw survival. It's from this rugged terrain that the tulip first caught human attention. Nomadic tribes in what's now Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan admired these flowers not for their fragility, but their surprising strength. You imagine someone squatting beside a red and yellow bloom, thinking, you again. You're prettier than the goats. Tulips spread slowly westward, carried in pouches, sewn into robes, tucked away in saddlebags. By the 11th century, they'd already charmed the Seljuks, early Turkic rulers who'd leave their architectural stamp on what would become the Ottoman world. The Seljuks were among the first to make tulips part of visual language, petal patterns and tiles, floral reliefs on mosque walls. So when the Ottomans rose to power a few hundred years later, they were already inheriting a floral affection. By the time you reach the 15th century and the rise of the Ottoman Empire proper, tulips are everywhere in court imagery. But it's not until the reign of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the robe-wearing, poetry-loving, empire-expanding guy, that tulips get their first real moment in the sun. Quite literally. The Sultan loved gardens. Loved control. Loved symbolism. So naturally, he loved tulips. You're walking now beside a marble fountain, octagonal, of course. The Ottomans adored geometry. It reflected divine order. The water slips over the edges in a whisper, and beside it grows a bed of slim, tall tulips, elegant, flame-shaped, each one slightly different, yet perfectly arranged. Suleiman, whose official title was something like Shadow of God on Earth, commissioned tulip gardens that were precise down to the finger width. Each garden was not just a hobby, it was a metaphor. The empire was vast, chaotic, filled with rebellion and friction. But the garden? The garden stayed perfect. Historians still argue whether Suleiman truly saw tulips as divine symbols, or just appreciated how quietly expensive they were. A tulip doesn't boast. It doesn't clang like a sword or glare like gold. It just stands there, lovely and smug. And in a time when heads literally rolled for wearing the wrong hat, maybe a flower's subtlety was part of its appeal. You move past a low stone bench where someone, long gone, once read poems aloud to a flowerbed. Maybe it was Suleiman himself. He wrote under the pen name Mahibi, meaning the lover. His verses were full of yearning, of moonlit metaphors, of tulips. One tulip, in particular, became something of a court celebrity. It was called the Black Tulip, though it wasn't actually black. More of a deep, velvety plum. Almost like ink just before it dries. It bloomed once during Suleiman's reign and then, allegedly, never again. That may be myth. Or a metaphor. Or just a very picky flower. Either way, the Sultan reportedly sat and stared at it for hours. You catch yourself doing the same now, gazing at a dark bloom with ridged edges, barely lit by the stars. Somewhere behind you, a lute plays two lazy notes. Somewhere even further, someone snores softly under a vine-draped portico. But don't wander off yet. We've still got more to trace. When the tulip finally made its way into the language of the empire, court records, miniature paintings, silk embroidery, it came bundled with symbolism. The tulip stood for balance, for restraint, for refinement. A flower that kept its petals closed was modest. One that drooped slightly was mournful. And one that bloomed fully without wilting quickly? Well, that was perfection. Which is to say, extremely rare and extremely prized. Fun fact, some tulips were bred not to open fully. Gardeners believed a tulip that opened too fast was impatient, and therefore tacky. A proper flower, like a proper courtier, kept its composure. You pass a row of these now, elegant, tight-lipped little flowers that seem to be quietly judging you for walking too loudly. And you wonder, did the tulip choose the Ottomans? Or did the Ottomans choose the tulip? Historians shrug. They're still debating whether the empire's devotion was strategic, aesthetic, spiritual, or just fashionable. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the tulips simply offered the empire a kind of peace it didn't find elsewhere. After all, you can't conquer a flower. You can only admire it. Or write about it. Or try, and usually fail, to grow the perfect one. So, as you walk deeper into this petal-filled world, let your shoulders relax. You're in the land of quiet obsessions now, where empires spoke in blooms, and flowers never raised their voices. You take a slow turn around another curved path. The stones beneath your feet are older now, worn smooth by centuries of sandal soles, embroidered slippers, and perhaps the occasional impatient janissary who really didn't care about flower beds. But tonight there's no one here but you, and the tulips. Always the tulips. You reach the edge of the garden and find a low wooden gate, painted once in bright vermilion, now faded into a blush of memory. Beyond it lies a different space, not a garden exactly, but a sort of courtyard laboratory. Here is where the real obsessives worked, the imperial tulip breeders. Yes, they existed. By the 17th century, under the rule of Sultan Ahmed III, tulip obsession had become, well, a bit much. You're now in the height of what later historians would call the Tulip Era, or L'Île d'Ivry, a period between roughly 1718 and 1730 when everything in the empire revolved, quite literally, around tulips. And not just in the gardens. Tulips spilled over into architecture, textiles, tea sets, pipe stems, mirror frames, sandals, sherbet recipes, and even turbans, some tied into the elegant shape of a single tulip petal. You couldn't swing a bejeweled parasol without hitting someone trying to breed a new tulip variant. You walk past rows of low, circular beds. Each one is labeled with a polished stone marker bearing its tulip's poetic name. Moonlight Flame, Laughing Sultana, Night Shadow. The names were written in Ottoman Turkish calligraphy, so intricate it's practically a flower in itself. There's a man hunched by one of the beds, not a ghost, don't worry, just a memory. He's examining the soil, whispering calculations to himself. Maybe he's testing compost ratios. Maybe he's just arguing quietly with a flower that refuses to bloom straight. Either way, He's part of a class of professionals who were deadly serious about petals. These breeders didn't just plant and hope. They curated. They hand-selected seeds, crossbred obsessively, and kept detailed notes in books bound in leather or pressed silk. Some even created their own floral shorthand to protect their breeding secrets. Think of it as the imperial version of a garden hacker. The goal? Broken tulips. Now that might sound like something sad, but broken tulips were the crown jewels of the Tulip Era. Broken refers to a kind of color striation, those dramatic flame-like streaks of color you sometimes see in fancy tulips. Red against yellow, purple against white. They looked hand-painted. What nobody realized at the time, of course, was that this broken pattern was actually caused by a virus. Yes, a literal virus, specifically the tulip-breaking virus, that interfered with pigment production in the petal. But since microscopes weren't exactly standard in 18th century Istanbul garden sheds, they just thought the flowers were touched by divine inspiration. Historians still argue whether the breeders knew the virus was somehow connected to certain bulbs, or whether they just chalked it up to fate. Either way, they chased broken tulips like treasure hunters. A good one could spark jealous gossip across court circles. And prices? Let's not even begin. Actually, no, let's do. Some tulip bulbs during this time sold for absurd amounts. In some records, you'll find rare bulbs being traded for several times the yearly salary of a court official. Other stories suggest that certain high-end bulbs were gifted as diplomatic tokens, more valuable than jewels. And no, you couldn't just pop down to a bazaar and pick one up. These were invitation-only transactions, handled with fanfare and secrecy. Think black market flower auctions, but with more sherbet. You pause before a particularly elegant tulip, tall, narrow, its petals curled inward like it knows it's better than the rest. It's painted onto a tile here, immortalized. That specific flower may no longer exist. Many of these rare varieties have been lost to time, soil changes, or sheer human forgetfulness. But in this quiet tile, it survives. Funny thing, the obsession even had rules. During the Tulip Era, official regulations were passed banning commoners from buying or selling tulip bulbs at high prices. The court was worried it might spark social unrest, because yes, tulips were that powerful. One scribe even called them delicate tyrants. And tyrants they were. Gardeners lost sleep. Scribes composed long odes. Poets debated whether a tulip's upward tilt symbolized arrogance or longing. Entire festivals were planned around the blooming season. Imagine it, the imperial gardens flooded with flickering lanterns, delicate pastries shaped like tulips, guests in soft robes wandering through paths of candles and flowers. All held not in daylight, but after sunset. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about the hush, the glow, the trance. You can almost hear it now, the rustle of silks, the soft laughter over a chilled rose syrup drink, the quiet gasp of someone spotting a bloom they've never seen before. In those moments, the tulip was more than just a flower. It was an experience. A mystery you stepped into with your whole being. And you? You're here now. Maybe not dressed in embroidered velvet, but you've got something better, time. Time to walk slowly. Time to listen to petals rustle. Time to imagine a world where power didn't shout, but bloomed silently in crimson stripes. You take a slow turn around another curved path. The stones beneath your feet are older now, worn smooth by centuries of sandal soles, embroidered slippers, and perhaps the occasional impatient janissary who really didn't care about flower beds. But tonight there's no one here but you, and the tulips. Always the tulips. You reach the edge of the garden and find a low wooden gate, painted once in bright vermilion, now faded into a blush of memory. Beyond it lies a different space, not a garden exactly, but a sort of courtyard laboratory. Here is where the real obsessives worked, the imperial tulip breeders. Yes, they existed. By the 17th century, under the rule of Sultan Ahmed III, tulip obsession had become, well, a bit much. You're now in the height of what later historians would call the Tulip Era, or l'Île d'Ivry, a period between roughly 1718 and 1730 when everything in the empire revolved, quite literally, around tulips. And not just in the gardens. Tulips spilled over into architecture, textiles, tea sets, pipe stems, mirror frames, sandals, sherbet recipes, and even turbans, some tied into the elegant shape of a single tulip petal. You couldn't swing a bejeweled parasol without hitting someone trying to breed a new tulip variant. You walk past rows of low, circular beds. Each one is labeled with a polished stone marker bearing its tulip's poetic name. Moonlight Flame, Laughing Sultana, Night Shadow. The names were written in Ottoman Turkish calligraphy, so intricate it's practically a flower in itself. There's a man hunched by one of the beds, not a ghost, don't worry, just a memory. He's examining the soil, whispering calculations to himself. Maybe he's testing compost ratios. Maybe he's just arguing quietly with a flower that refuses to bloom straight. Either way, he's part of a class of professionals who were deadly serious about petals. These breeders didn't just plant and hope. They curated. They hand-selected seeds, crossbred obsessively, and kept detailed notes in books bound in leather or pressed silk. Some even created their own floral shorthand to protect their breeding secrets. Think of it as the imperial version of a garden hacker. The goal? Broken tulips. Now that might sound like something sad, but broken tulips were the crown jewels of the Tulip Era. Broken refers to a kind of color striation, those dramatic flame-like streaks of color you sometimes see in fancy tulips. Red against yellow, purple against white. They looked hand-painted. What nobody realized at the time, of course, was that this broken pattern was actually caused by a virus. Yes, a literal virus, specifically the tulip-breaking virus, that interfered with pigment production in the petal. But since microscopes weren't exactly standard in 18th century Istanbul garden sheds, they just thought the flowers were touched by divine inspiration. Historians still argue whether the breeders knew the virus was somehow connected to certain bulbs, or whether they just chalked it up to fate. Either way, they chased broken tulips like treasure hunters. A good one could spark jealous gossip across court circles. And prices? Let's not even begin. Actually, no, let's do. Some tulip bulbs during this time sold for absurd amounts. In some records, you'll find rare bulbs being traded for several times the yearly salary of a court official. Other stories suggest that certain high-end bulbs were gifted as diplomatic tokens, more valuable than jewels. And no, you couldn't just pop down to a bazaar and pick one up. These were invitation-only transactions, handled with fanfare and secrecy. Think black market flower auctions, but with more sherbet. You pause before a particularly elegant tulip, tall, narrow, its petals curled inward like it knows it's better than the rest. It's painted onto a tile here, immortalized. That specific flower may no longer exist. Many of these rare varieties have been lost to time, soil changes, or sheer human forgetfulness. But in this quiet tile, it survives. Funny thing, the obsession even had rules. During the Tulip Era, official regulations were passed banning commoners from buying or selling tulip bulbs at high prices. The court was worried it might spark social unrest, because yes, tulips were that powerful. One scribe even called them delicate tyrants. And tyrants they were. Gardeners lost sleep. Scribes composed long odes. Poets debated whether a tulip's upward tilt symbolized arrogance or longing. Entire festivals were planned around the blooming season. Imagine it, the imperial gardens flooded with flickering lanterns, delicate pastries shaped like tulips, guests in soft robes wandering through paths of candles and flowers. All held not in daylight, but after sunset. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about the hush, the glow, the trance. You can almost hear it now, the rustle of silks, the soft laughter over a chilled rose syrup drink, the quiet gasp of someone spotting a bloom they've never seen before. In those moments, the tulip was more than just a flower. It was an experience. A mystery you stepped into with your whole being. And you? You're here now. Maybe not dressed in embroidered velvet, but you've got something better, Time. Time to walk slowly. Time to listen to petals rustle. Time to imagine a world where power didn't shout, but bloomed silently in crimson stripes. You leave behind the breeding beds and wander deeper into the heart of the palace grounds. There's no formal trail now, just winding gravel paths through tall hedges, ivy-covered pavilions, and scattered alcoves for poetry readings or whispered gossip. The air is thicker here, scented with crushed mint and warm earth. You duck beneath a low archway, step over a curled garden hose, anachronistic, maybe, but we'll allow it, and emerge into a shaded terrace. Before you, rows upon rows of carefully potted tulips, each perched like a miniature guest on its own little pedestal. This is where things start to feel really obsessive. By the peak of the Tulip Era in the early 18th century, the Ottomans had perfected the art of growing tulips not just in beds, but in individual ceramic pots, each one painted with delicate calligraphy or stylized clouds. These pots weren't just functional. They were status symbols. Because what good is a perfect flower if you can't display it like a crown? And display they did. Imperial tulip shows were the red carpet events of the court season. But instead of gowns and tiaras, guests paraded in softly layered silks, perfumed with orange blossom or sandalwood. And the stars weren't actors. They were flowers. Each tulip was judged on everything from symmetry to petal tightness, color saturation, and how gracefully it nodded in the breeze. Tulips that drooped too soon? Banished. Tulips that opened too quickly? Gasp. Scandalous. You lean in now to study a particularly striking tulip painted onto a tile mural on the wall. Its petals are striped like a tiger's coat, vivid orange and jet black. You imagine the breeder who coaxed it into existence, likely wearing a deeply stained robe, hands permanently smelling of compost and jasmine soap. And maybe, just maybe, a touch of pride. Some records tell of garden contests so heated, one vizier allegedly accused another of swapping bulbs the night before judging. That's right, imperial tulip sabotage. You'll be relieved to know it didn't end in exile. Just an awkward poetry duel and several passive-aggressive sherbets. But beneath all the courtly elegance, something more delicate was happening. A cultural fusion. See, the Ottomans didn't just admire tulips for their visual beauty. They believed flowers could teach things, about balance, patience, modesty. Much like a cup of tea or a line of calligraphy, tulips were meant to slow the mind. To draw your gaze into quiet contemplation. In a world of sultans and grand viziers, where politics could turn violent and alliances fragile, the tulip was something, still, but never dull. Historians still argue whether this fixation was escapism or aesthetics. Was the empire trying to distract itself from deeper problems? Economic strains, military failures, creeping instability? Maybe. But then again, who hasn't rearranged their desk when the world feels overwhelming? The Tulip Era was, in many ways, an aesthetic pause. A soft, flowering breath between louder chapters of conquest and reform. And like all beautiful distractions, it couldn't last forever. You find a bench beneath a fig tree and sit. It's warm from the day's sun. A bird rustles in the branches above, sending down a lazy drift of petals and dust. And as you sit, a story comes back to you, one whispered at court parties and hinted at in satirical poems. There was once a man who tried to grow a tulip that changed color at night. Yes. A night-blooming, color-shifting tulip. Did it work? Of course not. But his attempts were legendary. He planted his bulbs beneath mirrors, fed them silver-infused water, read them lullabies, and only trimmed them under moonlight. In the end, his flower did bloom, but it was just a very confused red tulip with oddly shaped leaves. Still, it got a poem. These are the kinds of stories that make the Tulip Era what it is, not just a period of horticultural experimentation, but of gentle madness. A nobleman once designed an entire watermill-powered display that rotated tulip pots in slow circles to mimic the sun. Another commissioned a miniature palace made entirely of tulip wood for a flower he considered too shy to be outdoors. It's easy to laugh at the extravagance. But then again, Aren't we all looking for small, perfect things? Things that bloom briefly, quietly, beautifully, asking nothing more than to be seen? So you sit a little longer. Let the warmth of the bench soothe your back. Let the petals drift. Let the quiet do what it's meant to do, lull you. Gently. Petal by petal. You rise from the bench and drift toward a narrow corridor lined with intricate blue and white isnic tiles. Their delicate floral patterns swirl and curl, flowers within flowers, reminding you how deeply the tulip had woven itself into Ottoman art. You run a finger lightly over a tulip-shaped motif, tracing the graceful lines as if you could feel the flower's heartbeat beneath the glaze. It's here that the tulip moved beyond the garden and became a language of design, a whispered symbol in textiles, ceramics, and even architecture. Ottoman artisans didn't just paint tulips because they were pretty, they painted them because they spoke of elegance, order, and the fleeting nature of life. Petals opening slowly, then closing at dusk, reminding the observer of beauty's impermanence. You imagine sitting in a palace room where the walls themselves seem to breathe tulip patterns, their curves and colors soothing the eye like a lullaby. Some historians still argue whether these patterns were purely decorative or also held secret meanings, maybe a nod to the spiritual cycles of life and death, or even a subtle political statement about the empire's fragility. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the shadows. As you walk, your footsteps echo softly, blending with the faint sound of a ney flute playing somewhere just beyond the walls. The music is slow, wistful, almost like a sigh, perfect accompaniment to the quiet world of the tulip. The Ottoman fascination with tulips even reached into clothing. You recall a story about the famed tulip hats, tall and elegantly curved, worn by men of rank during the Tulip Era. These hats were said to mimic the shape of the flower, symbolizing refinement and the wearer's connection to the empire's blossoming culture. You wonder how comfortable they were, likely about as practical as balancing a flower pot on your head while trying to sip tea. And tea itself became part of this floral symphony. Ottoman tea ceremonies during the Tulip Era were infused with a slow rhythm, much like the gardens. The act of sipping tea, watching the steam curl, became a ritual to slow the mind and invite gentle reflection. Tulip-shaped tea glasses appeared, their delicate curves echoing the petals you've been following all evening. There's an odd tension in this quiet obsession. The empire was vast and often violent, a place where power was as much about sharp swords as soft silk. Yet, in the tulip, you find a rare place for softness, a break from the harsh edges of politics and conquest. But not everyone loved the tulip craze. Some traditionalists frowned at the extravagance, seeing it as frivolous or distracting. They warned that such obsession with flowers was a sign of decadence, a sign the empire had lost its grip on reality. And their worries weren't unfounded. The tulip bubble, like many bubbles before and after, eventually burst. The extravagant prices, the social tensions, the jealousy, it all came to a head in 1730 with a rebellion known as the Patrona Jaleo Revolt. Among the grievances were those flower prices, seen as a symbol of elite excess while ordinary people struggled. But even rebellion couldn't erase the tulip's mark. After the chaos, the empire pulled back from its floral frenzy but never forgot the flower's quiet beauty. Tulips remained a cultural touchstone, a reminder of a softer moment in a sometimes harsh world. You pause at a small courtyard fountain, its water bubbling gently. You imagine that, centuries ago, courtiers might have gathered here, sipping sherbet, watching petals float on the water's surface. The tulip, once again, as a symbol of fleeting pleasure. And now you're part of this history. A traveler moving slowly through gardens, stories, and petals, feeling the gentle pulse of a flower that once captured an empire's heart. You smile softly, inhale the night air rich with scent and memory, and let your thoughts drift. You follow a softly lit corridor toward a secluded room where the empire's poets and philosophers once gathered, their voices low and reflective, much like the night around you. The air here seems heavier with thought, filled with the kind of quiet contemplation that tulips inspired. It might surprise you, but tulips were more than just pretty flowers to Ottoman intellectuals. They were metaphors for life, beauty, and sometimes even love. Poets penned verses comparing a lover's face to the delicate bloom of a tulip, its fragility and fleeting grace captured in every line. You can almost hear the gentle murmur of recited couplets, the soft tapping of fingers on silk scrolls. One favorite metaphor was the tulip's short lifespan, a symbol for how beauty fades but memory lingers. Poets wrote that a tulip's bloom, though brief, was intense, just like passion. Historians still argue whether this poetic obsession reflected a genuine spiritual meditation or was simply courtly fashion. Either way, tulips sparked an entire subculture of artistic expression. Miniature painters immortalized tulips in tiny brushstrokes on manuscripts, carefully mixing colors to capture every gradient and stripe. In some cases, the tulip appeared alongside mystical symbols, blending the earthly with the divine. You imagine the quiet flicker of candlelight in these rooms, the smell of ink and beeswax, the sound of a distant ney flute carrying through the corridors. Poets weren't just praising flowers, they were creating an entire worldview around them, where life's fleeting moments were celebrated in slow, gentle reverence. The tulip's symbolic weight extended into Sufi mysticism too. Some thinkers saw the flower as a reminder to detach from worldly concerns and embrace the beauty of the present moment. This idea fits perfectly with the empire's broader cultural emphasis on balance, harmony, and subtlety. But not all tulip-related art was serious. You might chuckle to learn that tulip caricatures sometimes appeared in satirical poems and drawings. One famous cartoonish image showed a tulip wearing a fez and smoking a tiny pipe, poking fun at the obsession's more ridiculous extremes. Such light-hearted mockery was part of how the court kept itself in check, laughing quietly at its own peculiarities. The tulip also found its way into everyday life beyond poetry and painting. Craftsmen carved tulip shapes into wooden furniture, blacksmiths hammered tulip patterns into iron gates, and jewelers crafted delicate tulip-shaped brooches that caught the light just so. You brush your hand over a carved wooden chair beside you, feeling the smooth curves of a tulip petal echoed in the grain. It's a reminder that the tulip wasn't just an imperial whim. It was woven into the very fabric of Ottoman daily life. As you settle into this quiet room, you realize something. The tulip obsession wasn't just about flowers. It was about slowing down, noticing details, and finding moments of calm amid an empire always on the move. A soft breath escapes you. The world outside may rush and roar, but here, in the shadow of petals and poems, there's peace. You step out of the poet's chamber and wander into a narrow hall lined with dusty crates and mysterious bundles of dried herbs and spices. The faint aroma of cardamom and cloves mingles with a subtle undertone of damp earth, grounding you. This is where the empire's fascination with tulips takes a surprising turn, from art and poetry to medicine. Though it might sound unlikely, tulips weren't just admired for their looks. Ottoman herbalists experimented with the flower's petals and bulbs, seeking healing powers. Tulip petals were sometimes brewed into infusions thought to calm nerves, ease digestion, or even soothe insomnia. The idea of a tulip tea to gently lull you to sleep doesn't seem so far-fetched in this softly glowing space. You imagine a dimly lit apothecary's workshop, shelves lined with jars and vials, an old healer carefully measuring powdered petals into a copper pot. Some records mention tulip water being used as a gentle facial tonic, prized for its refreshing scent and soothing qualities. A sort of ancient botanical spa treatment, long before spas were a thing. Historians still argue whether these medical uses were genuinely effective or mostly placebo wrapped in poetic promise. After all, the Ottoman love of tulips was as much about symbolism as science. But it's easy to believe that sipping on a tulip-infused tea on a warm evening, with the soft breeze carrying scents of jasmine and mint, might just help you relax. Beyond health, tulips also played a part in social rituals tied to wellness and status. During the Tulip Era, gifting rare tulip bulbs was akin to sending good wishes for prosperity and good health. These bulbs were treasured possessions, passed between nobles and merchants like precious currency. You might find it amusing that some bulbs reportedly changed hands for prices equal to several years' wages. Imagine the tension at these flower auctions: whispers, calculated glances, and perhaps a gentle sneeze or two from all the pollen floating in the air. And speaking of pollen, here's a quirky detail. Some Ottoman gardeners believed that playing music near tulips helped them grow better. Specifically, soft tunes on the ney or oud were thought to encourage blooms to open more fully. Whether this was science or sweet superstition, it adds a lovely layer of magic to the story. As you run your fingers over a bundle of dried tulip petals resting on a nearby shelf, you think about how deeply intertwined these flowers were with everyday life, not just symbols or art objects, but companions to health, relaxation, and even superstition. A final thought. Tulip bulbs were also used in cosmetic concoctions, blended into creams to soften skin or lighten blemishes. A beauty regimen centuries ahead of its time, but wrapped in the empire's characteristic blend of practicality and poetry. You breathe in again, feeling the mingling scents of herbs and flowers settle gently. The tulip's quiet journey from garden to medicine cabinet reminds you of the many layers beneath its simple beauty. Outside, the night deepens. The empire's obsession with tulips was more than a fad. It was a multifaceted love story, told in petals, poems, potions, and whispers. You leave the apothecary behind and find yourself wandering into the bustling streets of Istanbul during the Tulip Era, though you hear none of the usual clatter or crowd noise. Instead, you imagine the soft shuffle of slippers on cobblestones, the distant call of a merchant, and the faint rustle of silk robes. The city is alive, but in a gentle way, like a cat stretching in a sunbeam. In these streets, tulips weren't confined to the gardens or the palace walls, they had spilled into everyday life. Tulip motifs appeared everywhere, on ceramics, carpets, coffee cups, and even the wooden shutters of modest homes. This wasn't just elite obsession, it was a shared aesthetic that wrapped the city in floral warmth. A favorite pastime in the city was the tulip market, held in an open square surrounded by stalls bursting with colors. Here, merchants shouted gentle praises of their bulbs and blooms, bargaining with a mix of humor and seriousness. You imagine yourself holding a rare striped bulb, feeling its weight, wondering if it's worth the price. Some bulbs were so prized they had nicknames. The Sultan's Smile, the Night Whisper, or the Veiled Beauty. People told stories about their origins, whispering rumors that certain bulbs could bring luck and love or wealth. You might smile at the story of a merchant who, desperate to sell a particularly ugly bulb, claimed it was enchanted to bloom only under the light of the full moon. That poor tulip stayed in the stall until a curious child tugged at it and discovered it was just shy. The tulip market wasn't just about commerce. It was social theater, a place to meet, gossip, and slow down in the hum of city life. Historians still debate whether this widespread enthusiasm was a genuine cultural movement, or a clever way for elites to exert influence by controlling access to prized bulbs. Coffee houses added another layer to this floral tapestry. As you imagine sitting in one, sipping bitter black coffee from a tulip-shaped glass, you hear the low murmur of conversations about poetry, politics, and the latest floral trends. Coffee houses were places of ideas, where the tulip's symbolism extended into debates about empire, art, and identity. The tulip craze even sparked some unexpected consequences. With so many people obsessed, gardens sprang up everywhere, from palace terraces to tiny courtyard pots. Yet, this intense demand for bulbs led to overplanting and occasional shortages, which in turn fueled speculation and inflated prices. There's a fascinating little detail here. Some gardeners would secretly plant bulbs in neighbors' gardens overnight, hoping to impress or confuse. Imagine waking up to find a mysterious tulip blooming in your yard, a botanical prank centuries before the age of memes. As you stroll through this imagined cityscape, you realize the tulip had become a kind of gentle cultural glue. It connected palaces and markets, poets and merchants, nobility and common folk in a shared appreciation of beauty and calm. This was a world that knew how to savor the small things, a soft petal, a whispered poem, a fleeting bloom. And tonight, you're wandering right alongside them. You follow a quiet path leading away from the city's vibrant bustle toward the empire's quieter corners, small villages and countryside estates where the tulip's reach was more subtle, yet still significant. Here, away from the palace splendor and market chatter, the flower's influence took on a more intimate, everyday quality. Farmers and gardeners cultivated tulips alongside vegetables and herbs, not just for beauty but as part of practical traditions. You imagine a cool morning, dew still clinging to broad leaves, as a gardener carefully tends to a patch of tulips, whispering old sayings about the flower's power to bring peace to the household. One popular folk belief was that planting tulips near the front door would keep away bad luck or evil spirits. This quiet superstition coexisted with the empire's more elaborate rituals, blending the poetic with the practical. Historians still debate how widespread such beliefs really were versus being romanticized later by storytellers. In these rural pockets, tulips were also woven into seasonal celebrations. At the spring equinox, communities held gentle festivals featuring music, dance, and naturally, displays of freshly bloomed tulips. These gatherings weren't extravagant court affairs but warm, neighborly events where the tulips symbolized renewal and hope. You picture a circle of villagers, hands joined loosely, swaying to the rhythm of a soft drum and the lilting sound of a flute, petals floating down like confetti. Children chase after the flowers, their laughter mingling with the scent of earth and blossoms. The tulip symbolism in these settings was deeply connected to cycles of life, death, and rebirth. Its ephemeral beauty reminded people to savor moments of joy amid the harder realities of rural life. This gentle philosophy of impermanence found echoes in daily routines, from the way families prepared food to the storytelling passed around evening fires. Interestingly, some villages developed unique tulip varieties, prized for their unusual colors or shapes. These local cultivars became points of pride and identity, each with its own story or legend. You might smile at the tale of a tulip that supposedly bloomed only on moonlit nights, inspiring a village's name meaning moonflower. But tulips in rural life were more than charm and myth. They also had economic importance. Surplus bulbs were sometimes sold in nearby towns, connecting these quiet corners with the wider empire's bustling trade networks. This balance of beauty, belief, and livelihood encapsulates a softer side of the Ottoman tulip story, one less often told but just as vital. You breathe in the crisp countryside air, the scent faint but unmistakable, and feel yourself part of this timeless rhythm. The tulip, after all, was not just an imperial obsession. It was a flower for all people, whispering quietly in gardens, markets, and hearts alike. You wander further into the Ottoman world, now tracing the delicate footsteps of commerce and trade that carried the tulip beyond the empire's borders. Imagine ancient caravans winding through dusty desert routes and bustling Mediterranean ports, the scent of spices mingling with the promise of rare flowers. The tulip, once a humble bulb in Anatolia, had become a prized export and symbol of cultural exchange. You picture merchants in vibrant robes negotiating prices, their voices rising and falling in a cadence as gentle as a lullaby. Tulip bulbs were packed carefully among silk bolts, precious metals, and spices like saffron and cinnamon. These precious cargoes traveled to far-off lands, Persia, Europe, even as far as China, each culture eager to glimpse this flower that had captivated an empire. Interestingly, tulips sparked a sort of early global fascination. In the 17th century, the Dutch took this obsession to a new level, sparking their own famous tulip mania. Historians still debate how much the Ottoman tulip craze directly influenced this European frenzy. Some scholars argue that the tulip's journey highlights the subtle ways cultures borrow and transform symbols, while others see it as a coincidence fueled by broader economic forces. Back in the Ottoman markets, tulip bulbs were more than commodities. They were ambassadors of beauty and refinement. You imagine exotic travelers receiving bouquets of tulips as gifts, their delicate petals bridging languages and customs. These flowers carried stories, poetry, and even political messages wrapped in their vibrant folds. Trade wasn't without challenges. Tulip bulbs were fragile and required careful handling. Some bulbs failed to bloom in foreign soils, leading to disappointment and occasional superstition. There are tales of bulbs sent to European royal gardens that mysteriously withered, fueling rumors of tulip jealousy or curses. Whether fact or fancy, these stories add a playful mystique to the tulip's global journey. Meanwhile, Ottoman artisans adapted foreign influences into their own tulip art. Persian floral motifs merged with Ottoman designs, creating hybrid patterns that celebrated the flower's evolving identity. It's like the tulip itself was a traveler, changing and growing with each new home. You pause to imagine the scent of jasmine mingling with tulips on a Mediterranean breeze, the sounds of distant markets and ship horns blending into a soft hum. Trade routes, after all, weren't just about goods. They were the veins through which culture, ideas, and beauty flowed. And you, now, are a part of that flow, a quiet observer tracing the petals of history across continents. The tulip's voyage reminds you how even something as delicate as a flower can connect worlds in unexpected, gentle ways. You drift now into the quieter side of the tulip story, where the flower's place in Ottoman gardens reveals a lot about daily life and leisure. Picture yourself in a vast garden courtyard bathed in the soft afternoon light, the air thick with the scent of earth and blooms. Fountains trickle nearby, their gentle splashes blending with the hum of bees lazily visiting tulip petals. These gardens were more than decoration. They were sanctuaries from the day's heat and noise, carefully designed spaces where the empire's elite and commoners alike could unwind. Tulips were a centerpiece, planted in intricate patterns that seemed to flow like poetry across the soil. You notice how tulips were often arranged by color and variety, each bed telling a story or symbolizing a mood. Red tulips might speak of passion or strength, while white ones suggested purity or peace. Gardeners cultivated the flowers with almost religious devotion, experimenting with soil, shade, and watering to coax the most beautiful blooms. A quirky detail: some gardeners kept secret recipe books, filled with tips on growing tulips, mixing folklore with practical advice. For example, adding crushed eggshells to the soil was believed to encourage brighter colors, a folk remedy that scientists today recognize for its calcium boost. Historians still debate how much of the tulip mania was driven by actual horticultural innovation versus status signaling. Was it genuine botanical passion, or a carefully staged performance for social standing? Perhaps it was a bit of both, a gentle dance between love of beauty and desire for prestige. Tulip gardens were also places of social ritual. You imagine the soft murmur of courtly conversations, the clink of tea glasses, and the occasional laughter as guests wandered between flower beds. These spaces offered moments of calm connection, a respite from politics and power plays. Interestingly, tulip petals sometimes found their way into culinary experiments. Royal chefs crafted delicate syrups and sweets infused with tulip essence, aiming to capture the flower's subtle fragrance on the tongue. Whether these treats were delicious or just pleasantly perfumed, they added another sensory layer to tulip appreciation. You reach out to gently brush a velvety petal, feeling the soft texture beneath your fingertips. It's a tactile reminder that the tulip was a living, breathing part of everyday Ottoman life, not just a distant symbol. As you settle beneath the dappled shade of an ancient plane tree, you realize how these gardens embody the empire's quieter values: beauty, patience, and the slow unfolding of time. The tulip's presence here is a whisper of calm amid the empire's grandeur, a delicate bloom to rest your eyes upon. You now slip into the quieter side of Ottoman life, where the tulip's presence softly influenced personal identity and gender roles in subtle, intriguing ways. Picture a tranquil room filled with the faint scent of rosewater and candlelight flickering against painted walls, the sound of a gentle lute playing somewhere in the distance. Here, the tulip becomes not just a flower but a symbol woven into the fabric of daily rituals and social expectations. Women of the Ottoman elite often incorporated tulip motifs into their clothing and jewelry: embroidered scarves, silk gowns patterned with delicate tulip blossoms, and filigree earrings shaped like tiny flowers. These adornments were not only beautiful but also quietly coded messages about grace, fertility, and refinement. You might imagine a noblewoman admiring her reflection, the soft curve of a tulip petal mirrored in her jewelry. Meanwhile, men's turbans and robes occasionally featured tulip designs, signifying elegance and status without compromising masculinity. Historians still debate whether these floral patterns subtly challenged or reinforced traditional gender norms. Were tulips a gentle way to explore softer aesthetics, or simply a fashionable motif with no deeper meaning? A fascinating tidbit: tulips were also associated with romantic courtship. Young lovers exchanged tulip-themed gifts, sometimes actual bulbs, sometimes poems or embroidered handkerchiefs. These tokens carried layered meanings, from promises of devotion to playful teasing. You might smile at the image of a shy suitor nervously handing over a tulip bulb, hoping it would bloom as brightly as his feelings. Tulip symbolism also found its way into personal grooming rituals. Bathhouses, essential social hubs for both men and women, occasionally used tulip-scented oils and soaps. These gentle fragrances were believed to promote beauty and relaxation, turning an everyday routine into a sensory experience. You imagine stepping into a warm marble bath, the soft fragrance of tulips mingling with eucalyptus and rose, while attendants quietly prepare scented lotions. It's a moment of calm indulgence that echoes the empire's love of refined simplicity. Interestingly, tulips sometimes appeared in literature as metaphors for the idealized virtues of patience and resilience, qualities prized in both men and women. The flower's brief but brilliant bloom mirrored the fleeting nature of youth and beauty, inspiring gentle reflection rather than frantic pursuit. You run your fingers over a silk scarf patterned with tulips, feeling the smooth fabric and imagining the stories woven into each petal and stem. The tulip's quiet influence on gender and identity speaks to a culture that valued subtlety and layered meaning. Tonight, the tulip is more than a flower. It's a whisper of elegance and emotion, a soft thread connecting hearts and histories. As twilight deepens, you find yourself drawn into the quieter corners of Ottoman art, where the tulip's image flourished in paintings, ceramics, and calligraphy. Imagine the gentle scratch of a brush on fine paper, the soft patter of glazes being applied to delicate pottery, and the slow, deliberate flow of ink tracing elegant Arabic script. The tulip, in these hands, becomes a living symbol, quiet, refined, and endlessly adaptable. Ottoman artists adored the tulip's shape and simplicity. Its curves and points translated beautifully into stylized forms, often combined with flowing arabesques and geometric patterns. You picture a master painter in a dim studio, softly humming as he outlines petals with a fine brush dipped in lapis lazuli or gold. These floral designs weren't just decorative, they carried symbolic weight. The tulip's upward-reaching bloom suggested spiritual aspiration and beauty in balance. Sometimes, the flower appeared alongside verses of poetry celebrating life's fleeting pleasures, reminding viewers of the gentle passage of time. A curious detail: some ceramics featuring tulips had subtle imperfections deliberately left by the artist. These intentional flaws reflected the belief that perfection was divine and human art should embrace humility. It's a beautiful paradox, like the tulip itself, perfectly imperfect. Historians still debate whether tulip imagery was primarily a courtly trend or a more widespread artistic language. Recent discoveries suggest common folk also enjoyed tulip motifs on everyday items like plates, tiles, and textiles, blurring the lines between elite taste and popular culture. You can almost hear the quiet clink of porcelain cups resting on tulip-patterned trays in a sunlit room, the soft rustle of embroidered curtains, and the gentle murmur of poetry readings where these images inspired stories of love and loss. Interestingly, tulip motifs sometimes served as subtle political symbols. A certain pattern might indicate loyalty to a sultan or a particular court faction, floral diplomacy in delicate form. Imagine a gift of a vase adorned with a specific tulip variety, carrying an unspoken message of allegiance or peace. You trace the lines of a painted tulip on a ceramic tile, feeling the cool glaze beneath your fingertips. The art is a testament to the empire's love of beauty and simplicity, and its skill in weaving meaning into everyday objects. As night settles, these quiet symbols remind you that sometimes the softest stories leave the deepest impressions, like the tulip's gentle bloom, glowing briefly yet unforgettable. The tulip story now leads you into the realm of forgotten inventions and curious innovations inspired by this delicate flower. Imagine a quiet workshop filled with the faint scent of oils and wood shavings, where craftsmen tinker with designs that echo the tulip's elegant curves. Here, the flower's influence extends beyond beauty into the practical and the whimsical. Ottoman inventors and artisans devised a range of tulip-inspired creations, from ceramic vases shaped like petals to ingenious watering devices mimicking the flower's form, designed to keep gardens lush with minimal effort. You can almost hear the soft clink of tools and the gentle bubbling of water as these early irrigation systems quietly changed gardening forever. One lesser-known invention was the tulip-shaped perfume diffuser, which released fragrant vapors slowly throughout a room. Imagine a dimly lit chamber filled with the subtle aroma of rose and amber, the diffuser sending tendrils of scent curling lazily like petals unfolding in the morning sun. Historians still argue whether these devices were widely used or remained luxurious novelties reserved for the elite. In addition to objects, the tulip inspired musical instruments and accessories. Some lute makers crafted sound holes in the shape of tulip blossoms, believing this design improved acoustics. You can almost hear the soft, resonant notes of a lute played in a garden courtyard, petals drifting down as the music weaves through the air. Interestingly, the tulip also influenced fashion innovations. Designers experimented with layered fabrics and folds that mimicked petal shapes, creating garments that flowed and shimmered with subtle movement, an early form of textile artistry that blurred lines between nature and human creativity. Despite these innovations, some tulip-inspired inventions faded into obscurity as tastes and technologies changed. You imagine dusty shelves in forgotten workshops, tools and prototypes gathering quiet dust, waiting for rediscovery. The tulip's legacy as a muse for inventiveness reflects the Ottoman spirit, blending art, nature, and function in graceful harmony. It's a reminder that even the simplest natural forms can inspire creativity that lingers long after the flower itself has wilted. You breathe deeply, the scent of imagined tulip oil filling your senses, and feel connected to a line of dreamers who saw beauty not just in petals but in possibility. The flower's quiet influence reaches far beyond gardens, into the very fabric of life and invention. You drift now to the twilight of the tulip's golden age in the Ottoman Empire, a time when the flower's quiet charm began to fade amid changing tastes and turbulent times. Imagine yourself walking through a once glorious garden now touched by the soft melancholy of autumn, petals falling gently to the ground, a reminder that even the most beautiful things have their seasons. By the late 18th century, the tulip's reign as the empire's floral obsession was winding down. New artistic trends emerged, influenced by European styles and shifting political realities. You picture the sultans and their courts, their attentions drawn to other symbols of power and prestige, while the tulip quietly retreated into the background of cultural life. Historians still argue about why the tulip craze ended so suddenly. Was it political upheaval, economic pressures, or simply a natural cultural shift? Some suggest that the empire's growing challenges left less room for leisurely pursuits like tulip collecting. Others believe the flower's delicate bloom symbolized an era that simply passed. Interestingly, even as its popularity waned, the tulip remained a cherished motif in folk art and rural traditions. You might imagine a small village festival where the last blooms of the season are celebrated with simple songs and dances, a humble farewell to a flower that once captivated an empire. In literature and poetry, the tulip became a symbol of nostalgia and lost beauty. Writers lamented the passing of the tulip age, their words filled with longing and gentle sadness. This soft morning gave the flower a new kind of life, one rooted in memory rather than bloom. You breathe in the cool evening air, feeling the quiet grace of endings and beginnings mingling like shadows in the fading light. The tulip story teaches you about the beauty of impermanence and the gentle rhythms of change. Tonight, as you let your thoughts drift like falling petals, remember that every bloom is precious, even if fleeting. The Ottoman Empire's quiet obsession with tulips may have ended, but the flower's soft legacy continues to whisper across centuries, inviting you to slow down, notice, and simply be. As you settle into the gentle close of our journey, the pace slows and the edges of the story soften like twilight fading into night. Imagine the last petals drifting softly from an Ottoman tulip garden, the scent lingering just a whisper on the evening breeze. You feel the warmth of the day ebbing away, replaced by a soothing calm that invites your mind to rest. The tulip, in its quiet bloom and brief brilliance, reminds you of the simple beauty found in patience and subtlety. Its story is not of thunderous battles or sweeping conquests, but of delicate moments, of gardens tended with care, of art inspired by nature's gentle touch, of a culture that cherished elegance without excess. As you breathe slowly, let your thoughts drift along the soft currents of history's gentle flow. Feel the weight of the day lighten as the tulip's fragile petals fold into sleep, carrying you softly toward your own. Remember that even in the smallest things, the curve of a petal, the whisper of a breeze, there is a world of calm and wonder waiting to be discovered. So, as you rest tonight, carry with you the quiet grace of the tulip, its legacy blooming softly in the background of your dreams. Now allow your eyelids to grow heavy, the sounds around you dimming into a peaceful hush. Know that history's gentle stories will be here, waiting whenever you wish to return. Good night, and sweet dreams.